so today we're here to talk about authorized user trade lines and using them to build your credit, and some common things that are mistakenly given out as tricks with authorized user trade lines that are not so true. So, one of them being, and probably the most big one, is that the size of the trade line is going to affect your credit limits that you get on future cards. And I want you all to understand this. When you look at your credit factors, never once has FICO released your credit limit as a factor. Why not? Why has Fair Isaac, the company that hosts the trademark for the credit score, not released the amount of a trade line as a factor in your credit? Because it does not factor into your credit score. That's why it doesn't affect your credit score how much the trade line is. So if you are looking at a $10,000 trade line that's 3 months old and a $300 trade line that's 10 years old, that $300 trade line holds way more value with all of that age and history behind it. Assuming that they both have 100% payment history and everything's the same, utilization, everything. When you add that trade line with the extra time on it, it's going to make a much larger difference. I see so many people talking about trade lines and adding trade lines, and you have these people out here who are telling you guys, hey, go and spend all this money and buy 10 trade lines and add them to your credit report. And if you add trade lines for 10 and 20,000, you're going to automatically get approved for 10 and 20,000. Not true. Because what actually happens is every bank has its own underwriting process. Every credit union has its own underwriting process. And when you go into underwriting, some banks don't even count trade lines. Others do. Now, if they don't count trade lines, then it just doesn't matter. You just spent all that money and wasted it for nothing. If you're with a bank that does count them in, then okay, great. However, they're going to look at the history and the performance of that trade line over the value of that trade line. What's going to make the biggest difference with that initial limit that you get is going to be your prior relationship with that bank, as well as your debt to income ratio and how much money you make annually. Because it doesn't matter if you have $100,000 trade line on your credit. If you don't have any income, you're not going to get a high limit card. If you have low income, you're not going to get these high limit cards just off of adding trade lines. Yes, it's possible to get high limit cards with low income, but typically that means your debt to income ratio is low and amongst your primaries, because most banks are now have caught on to the whole AU system, and they're checking your primaries to make sure your primaries are good. Now, once again, banks are also starting to catch on to AU. So this is another thing that I want you guys to realize is, myth number 2, that AUs are always going to boost your score with the banks and boost your approval odds. Sometimes you add an AU and you get an AU, and depending on the bank and their underwriting process and if they want to approve you or not, they may factor that AU in, or they may not factor that AU in. So if that bank doesn't factor that AU in and you just went and spent all this money, $2,000, $3,000, I've seen people spending to get AUs, and then these AUs, some of them do not even count when you go into underwriting. So you've wasted all of that money. Now, the next thing that I want you to think about with getting AUs is there's nothing that guarantees that your AU is going to report to all 3. So you may get an AU, say your AU reports to Equifax and Experian. It doesn't report to TransUnion. It's a high limit AU. It has history, all these great things. However, that AU is not reporting to TransUnion. When you go to Synchrony, when you go to Navy Federal, when you go to, you know, Discover, depending on the day of the week, or, you know, Bank of America, and they pull TransUnion. When a bank pulls TransUnion, now you're in a situation where you're stuck because you spent all that money for an AU. Yes, you got 2 out of 3, but just the luck of the draw, your bank chose the third bureau. Now, why is that? Some banks pull at random. Some banks are strategic with their pulls. They will soft pull all 3 of your reports. They will see which one is the worst. Then they will pull off of the one that's the worst. Like I said, if a bank is low on approvals and they're trying to approve people, then they'll soft pull all 3 and they'll pull off your bureau that's the best. You know, these are lending practices. These are the things that go on. Banks have the right to check thoroughly your finances and make sure, to the best of their ability, that you're giving them the best knowledge that they can use to approve you or disapprove you. So they're also going to play this game in their favor. If they feel like you're trying to trick the system, they may ask you for a manual review. You know, a lot of times you'll see where you'll get that little notification. You know, you have a bunch of AUs. You think your credit's great, but you don't have any primaries. You apply for something. It says, hey, we'll get back to you in 7 to 10 business days. And then it tells you not enough revolving history or not enough installment history. And you're like, well, why am I getting this? And I had all these perfect trade lines on my credit report. Well, those perfect trade lines did not display your credit worthiness. And the automated system caught that. It sent it to a person. The person realized that did not display your credit worthiness. So instead of approving you, they disapproved you. Typically, if you go to manual underwriting and they see a bunch of trade lines, they assume that you're not very financially literate, and that you're trying to trick the system, you know, and or you're trying to trick the system. So they will deny it because they see all these trade lines, and those trade lines are telling them risk, 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 risk. Because why is this person buying trade lines? What made this person feel as though they needed to purchase someone else's credit history to put it on their report rather than just using their own credit history? So once again, another thing for you all to think about. So all in all, authorized user trade lines are not horrible. However, they can have their not so great moments, when they can definitely affect you getting approved for things as well as affect your pockets. Please, please, please do not go out spending countless amounts of money on authorized user trade lines, whereas you can spend that money on other things, education, or paying off your debts, or settling them rather than putting them into artificially boosting your credit score. And with that being said, thank you all for watching. Please stay tuned for more videos, and we'll see you guys in the next.